morning, everyone. Welcome to Resiliency and Mitigation Session, G3. First up, our first presentation is Infusing Nature-Based Solutions to Hazard Mitigation Plans, Creating Resilient and Sustainable Communities for the 21st Century. Our presenter is Carey Johnson. He's the Assistant Director of the Kentucky Division of Water.
Hello from lovely Frankfort, Kentucky. My name's Carey Johnson. I'm the Assistant Director of the Kentucky Division of Water and the immediate past chair of the Kentucky Association of Mitigation Managers. I've got my CAM sweater vest on today, so I'm ready to put my CAM hat on and share some best practices with you, the audience, on infusing nature-based solutions into state and local hazard mitigation plans. A quick overview of our agenda today. We'll do a quick overview of flooding hazards and risks in Kentucky, quick synopsis of the Kentucky National Flood Insurance Program and hazard mitigation programs, a quick overview of what nature-based solutions are and some best practices of nature-based solutions, specifically green infrastructure and low-impact development. We'll also get into Kentucky's ongoing efforts and a project that we're working on with many partners to incorporate nature-based solutions into our Commonwealth Enhanced Hazard Mitigation Plan. And finally, we'll close with some best practices and some examples of some great programs that are out there that could possibly be used or leveraged for you or your communities to implement some of these green infrastructure best practices. Flooding in Kentucky is absolutely our #1 natural hazard. Our state hazard mitigation plan identifies clearly flooding as our #1 natural hazard. Generally speaking, these flood flows, they result from heavy rains. But what we're focusing on, especially under the auspices of green infrastructure generally, are high flows from heavy rains in urban areas. And in these urban areas, high flows can increase erosion, definitely damage ecosystems and habitat, create havoc on infrastructure and property, both public and private. And then finally, can cause significant water pollution. One of the things that we should always remember when it comes to flooding is that water quality and quantity are inherently related. And by managing water quantity and or quality, you can generally somewhat manage the other. One of the issues that we've had over the years is bringing these two management strategies together in order to try to manage quality and quantity together. So these efforts that we have going on in Kentucky and actually in many other states across the nation to incorporate water quality like activities into water quantity activities for mitigation activities has become more profound. One of the things that is inherent in floodwater and certainly in stormwater are contaminants and trash and things that can make people sick. So it's very important that we address these issues and continue working to mitigate the hazards that they cause. In fact, urban flooding has become such an issue as of late that in 2019, the National Academy of Sciences conducted a study on urban flooding. We came up with many interesting conclusions, but some of the most interesting conclusions that I was able to glean from this study was that most urban floods are too small to trigger federal disaster declarations. So your things like public assistance, individual assistance, generally don't come into play for these urban type floods. They're mainly managed at a local level by a local stormwater utility, a local floodplain manager, emergency manager, and the like. One of the other interesting outcomes from the study was it was identified that stronger vertical and horizontal coordination is needed. And we've always kind of thought about strong vertical coordination between federal, state, even regional and local entities. Generally, the federal and the state agencies support local agencies. But the interesting thing and the key takeaway that I got from the study was the horizontal coordination that really needs to happen. And these are these local agencies that are responsible for your stormwater systems, like an MS4 community, a floodplain manager, a mayor's office, a local emergency manager. Again, federal agencies are generally responsible for providing data, providing warning, and providing support to local and state efforts, while the state folks are generally there to help coordinate the local efforts in order to not only respond to hazards, but also mitigate from those hazards. So very interesting takeaway, and not only, more coordination between federal, state, and local agencies are needed, but coordination between those varying local agencies, those varying state agencies, and those varying federal agencies is also needed as well. As far as the flood insurance program in Kentucky is concerned, we've been in the flood insurance program since the inception. The Kentucky Division of Water manages the NFIP for the Commonwealth. We have about 360 NFIP participating communities, 21,000 flood insurance policy. We have been a cooperating technical partner since 2005, meaning we are responsible in the Commonwealth for conducting flood hazard mapping on behalf of FEMA. So through the program, we've been able to digitally identify special flood hazards up to the 1 square mile drainage area in all counties, and we have 120 counties in Kentucky. But every county has digital maps with 1 square mile drainage watersheds. But the interesting thing with flood hazard mapping is it doesn't always pick up flood hazards in those urban areas where we see many issues. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the community rating system in Kentucky. We have about 33 of those CRS communities, but one of the key takeaways and one of the things that we continually see over and over, especially in Kentucky, are disaster declarations. And these are federal disaster declarations. And currently we have 19 of them, 19 open federal disaster declarations, meaning that we have ongoing hazard mitigation projects through hazard mitigation assistance in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. So we have our fair share of disasters. Most of them, with rare exception, most of those disasters have flooding related to them in the federal disaster declaration. As far as the hazard mitigation plan for the Commonwealth, we do have an enhanced hazard mitigation plan, meaning we qualify for 20% of disaster funds overall in our hazard mitigation grant program. So our friends in Kentucky Emergency Management have done a wonderful job managing the hazard mitigation grant programs and developing the hazard mitigation plan, not only for us to achieve enhanced status, but to really outline the goals in the hazard mitigation plan. And really overarching when it comes to this Commonwealth's hazard mitigation plan, our goals are to increase awareness for local communities, to coordinate, to reduce vulnerabilities within local jurisdictions, give local jurisdictions tools and data, and again, integrate not only agencies, but resources and funding so that we can share those with local agencies. So we're very highly focused on coordinating at the Commonwealth level to empower local jurisdictions to take action. One of the key goals that we have specifically in our hazard mitigation plan is a goal to decrease our repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss structures under the National Flood Insurance Program. Obviously, these structures are drained to the Flood Insurance Fund, and they are a significant mitigation priority for the Commonwealth. As I mentioned, we specifically reference repetitive loss and SRL, severe repetitive loss in Kentucky. One of the things that we also mention as far as not only the risk assessment, but also the mitigation strategies in the plan are references to green mitigation. We don't necessarily identify specific actions in local communities, but we do bring up the idea that green infrastructure is an up-and-coming technology, even though it really isn't. It's been around for a while. But as a mitigation strategy, implementing nature-based solutions, whether through green infrastructure or low-impact development concepts, are a true measure and a true true and tried way to mitigate flood hazards in communities. So we identified a need in the Commonwealth among our State Hazard Mitigation Council to update our hazard mitigation plan to include those specific nature-based mitigation actions, which will open up our local jurisdictions to a wide variety of resources that they may be able to employ for green infrastructure measures to reduce flood hazards and risks. When it comes to our collaborative efforts, our goal is to collaborate with everyone. As I mentioned before, our State Hazard Mitigation Council actually includes a quorum of the CAM board. So the CAM board is very heavily, and the CAM as a whole is very heavily invested in mitigation. We're not only a nonprofit organization and the ASFPM chapter, but our board members are represented on the State Hazard Mitigation Council, which is a great benefit. We participated in the Ohio River Basin Alliance, which is a comprehensive planning effort being done in conjunction with U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and ORSANCO, that's the Ohio River Sanitation Commission, to develop a strategic plan for needed investments in the Ohio River Basin. Luckily, in the Commonwealth, we have a friend in the Department of Local Government, and our Department of Local Government manages a fund specifically to match federal grants for local communities for flood risk reduction. We also manage, specifically the Kentucky Division of Water manages state-owned dam repair fund. So each year we receive a legislative appropriation for state-owned dams in order to bring them into compliance with state regulations and requirements. And another key partner that we've identified are Kentucky Nature Preserves. Our nature preserves do wonderful things, and they actually have it in their name. They preserve nature. One of the key things they do is they acquire sensitive areas like wetlands to preserve them from future development, from future use. And interestingly enough, in Kentucky, if you have to pay an environmental fine for some reason, some of that money goes to Kentucky Nature Preserves. So we use those dollars wisely in order to preserve our environment throughout the Commonwealth. I could go over a lot of the federal resources that are out there and how we collaborate with the agencies involved, but through hazard mitigation assistance, the three programs, Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, PDM, which will become BRIC in the very near future, flood mitigation assistance. As I mentioned, Kentucky Division of Water manages flood hazard map updates, so we manage the risk map program for the Commonwealth. We're also the state lead in the Kentucky Silver Jackets efforts. So Silver Jackets is a core-led effort, but it really brings federal, state, and local stakeholders together to discuss and manage and mitigate flood hazards. And then one of the things that we've brought into the fold is our Clean Water Act, Section 319 watershed planning efforts. Largely these have been for water quality planning efforts, but what we've realized is incorporating this into the overall efforts allows us to broaden our horizons and potentially use watershed planning efforts to not only identify water quality, but also water quantity benefits. When it comes to nature-based solutions, they're actually defined in Section 502 of the Clean Water Act. And more or less what they are, or green infrastructure at least, are nature mimicking like systems that allows for reduced flows in high flow events. And an interesting tidbit I came across while doing research for this presentation was that a 1 acre wetland can hold about 3 acre-feet of water. So it's 1 acre, 3 feet deep that a wetland can actually detain that would not normally be released into a natural stream system. So wetlands truly are nature's sponge, and they do a great job of retaining floodwaters during times of high flow events. When it comes to nature-based solutions, there's no need to recreate the wheel, and EPA has wonderful resources available on the green infrastructure page that folks can refer to. But those best practices really refer how to build, how to learn, how to partner with various agencies, not only to incorporate green infrastructure resources, but to mitigate hazards and water quality issues that are inherent with those hazards. Recently, there have been significant efforts between EPA and FEMA to collaborate better to manage flood-related mitigation efforts using those nature-based solutions. So as the Commonwealth, we were very refreshed to hear federal agencies working very diligently to collaborate on these efforts, and we were very quick to jump on the bandwagon, so to speak, because we realized the benefits that green infrastructure and nature-based solutions have in the overall toolbox for flood risk reduction. There's many examples of green infrastructure out there. I would start with anything from rainwater harvesting to bioswales and pervious pavement. These resources for best practices are available. They're out there. One of the things I would love to highlight is conservation of land and open space. There's so many benefits to conserving open space, especially open space that is sensitive meaning it floods there from time to time. But there are great examples and best practices on how folks can not only achieve some of these examples, but also operate and maintain them, because they do require operation and maintenance. So as I mentioned before, green infrastructure, it certainly isn't new. Local communities have been implementing these practices for years, and it's generally been a result of their MS4 programs or some type of EPA consent decree for water quality concerns. But one of the things that we've noticed, and many agencies across the nation have noticed, is that leveraging best practices for water management shouldn't really be tied to one agency over the other. We can all identify and utilize best practices and funding and resources, no matter where they come from. So one of the things that we haven't done very well in the past are leverage our statewide planning and mitigation efforts in a systematic manner. But that's one of the things that we're changing through the efforts that we're implementing. So what we're doing. So about 2 years ago or so, in 2018, we realized as our state hazard mitigation plan was being adopted that we had an additional need, and again, that need was identified through our flood risk assessment. But this was also when very many federal and regional and other agencies started to talk about and collaborate on green infrastructure resources. So we basically led the charge and started a relationship, or at least a conversation with several stakeholders, including EPA Region 4, FEMA Region 4, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Huntington and Louisville districts. The University of Kentucky Martin School, they actually author our state hazard mitigation plan in conjunction with Kentucky Emergency Management, who manages all the hazard mitigation programs across the Commonwealth. And then in the Division of Water, again, we have the NFIP and risk map programs for flood hazard identification. And then finally, the key, the absolute key, I think, to our overall efforts has been the Kentucky Association of Mitigation Managers. We've been able to use our ASFPM chapter to bring these partners together and to utilize the education and the outreach arm of CAM in order to really help get the word out. And our plans through CAM are to expand those education and outreach efforts of what we're doing here. So really quick rundown on what each of the partners are doing. EPA Region 4 has developed some best practices through GIS in order to identify suitable areas. So we're actually working with EPA Region 4 and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Huntington District, because they conducted a very similar green infrastructure and low impact development assessment for the city of Huntington, West Virginia, bringing those two together so we can collaborate on those GIS efforts. And again, FEMA Region 4 is partnered through our risk map and NFIP programs. Kentucky Emergency Management and University of Kentucky Martin School, they are authoring an addendum to state hazard mitigation plan, which includes the planning process for stakeholder engagement. So we're actually creating an addendum and basically a new chapter in our 28 enhanced state hazard mitigation plan to include green infrastructure concepts. And that includes meeting with our local area development districts. They are the authors of local community plans in the Commonwealth. There's 15 ads statewide. Each of those ads, with a few exceptions, authors all the local hazard mitigation plans. So we'll be collaborating with those entities through University of Kentucky and Kentucky Emergency Management to incorporate these nature-based solutions and specific solutions into local plans. As I mentioned, again, Division of Water, we've developed flood hazard data and identified areas of mitigation interest. So these can be leveraged into the overall efforts to find hotspots where green infrastructure may be utilized as a tool in the toolbox. And finally, again, CAM. CAM is the ASFPM state chapter. We've been around since about 2005 or so. When it comes to education and outreach, we do have an expansive network through our conference each year and through the training sessions that we put on each year. So basically what we'll be doing through our efforts in CAM, we'll be acting as the education and outreach arm of the overall project to provide training to local plan implementers at areas that have been prioritized through the process developed by EPA and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So in coordinating those efforts, including the area development districts, we'll be able to not only have an addendum to the state hazard mitigation plan, but also incorporate these efforts into each and every local hazard mitigation plan across the Commonwealth. And in order to accomplish this, CAM actually received a grant from EPA in October of 2019 to help with the outreach and the communication aspect of incorporating these concepts into the mitigation plan. One of the things that we wanted to mention that we're kind of researching as far as future enhancements or future resources it's a concern are source water assessment and protection plans. These plans may be used to protect riparian areas and to really protect source water areas from being contaminated, and source water being drinking water areas from being contaminated before it ever gets to a water treatment plant. There's some great opportunities, we believe, in the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund loans. So these are loans granted to states through EPA each year. These loans are paid back. So in paying the loans back, some states have opportunities to reinvest these funds in things like green infrastructure. Another great opportunity is the Community Development Block Grant Program through HUD. There's mitigation and disaster recovery, and Kentucky has several opportunity zones that we think we can take advantage of in order to implement some CDBG best practices. And finally, I want to mention, the tie-in with the community rating system. Part of the NFIP is the community rating system. And when it comes to green infrastructure, low impact development, and nature-based solutions, the concepts in Activity 420, open space preservations, and 450, stormwater management, certainly tie together very well. So those communities that are able to implement green infrastructure best practices will also likely be able to leverage them into a community rating system bump as well. Finally, I'd like to leave everyone with a few best practices. In doing the research, we've identified some great, not only projects, but resources out there that folks can use and leverage, and just get really some great ideas from. The Nature Conservancy's Floodplain by Design program is available for folks to do research on. EPA has a great smart growth program that really focuses on community activities and growing communities in a green manner to benefit resilience across many spectrums. And then also want to highlight those MS4 communities, because they do have programs, activities, and oftentimes funding available that can be leveraged and implemented for green infrastructure best practices. In Kentucky, we have 106 communities in 32 of our 120 counties. One of the strongest partners we have when it comes to MS4 communities is Louisville MSD. And interestingly enough, in implementing some of their green solutions, public opinion helped steer those decisions. So it's very interesting seeing that the public does understand and sees the benefits of using green solutions versus only gray or traditional basin or infrastructure type solutions for flood hazard and risk management. So with that, I hope everyone keeps in touch. I hope everyone was able to learn something from the presentation. We'd be happy to answer any questions. We've got a great one-stop shop website at kymitigation.org for CAM. We're working on it to update it for to align with the state hazard mitigation plan and identifying mitigation actions. Again, I'm Carey Johnson, Assistant Director of the Kentucky Division of Water, but I have my CAM hat on today as the past chair and founding member of CAM. And I can't say enough about my cohort in crime, so to speak, in this effort is Pamela Moore. She's CAM's Executive Director and has also been with CAM since our beginning days, and basically does everything CAM related. We don't know what we do without her. So hope everyone enjoyed and be happy to share any or answer any questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Carey. That was quite a comprehensive look at what's going on in Kentucky. First, wanted to note that you have 19 disasters. If those are all federal, that's amazing. That's a lot of work.
That's correct. Our folks are working 19.
A lot of good stuff. So
that's right.
Yes, I can. That's okay. Sorry. Start again. Okay. All right. Thank you, Carey, for that. That was quite a comprehensive look at what's going on in Kentucky. 19 open disasters. Wow, that's that's something else.
Right, and it keeps our friends at Kentucky Emergency Management extremely busy as they wade through the mitigation actions from those 19 ongoing disasters.
Wonderful, good to know. Well, we have a lot of really good questions too. I see some resources, so that's also good.
Yes.
One of the questions they answered or asked were, Stephanie asked, what are the challenges you see in implementing this type of green infrastructure, et cetera, in more heavily urban environment with TMDL and urban flooding? So let's start with that.
Absolutely. I mean, simply in an urban environment, the most limiting factor that you have, especially with green solutions, is space. And identifying areas that will be productive in a green solution manner. So you want areas that have flooding issues, urban runoff, and stormwater issues, but you also want to be able to assess the area so that you can build a comprehensive solution. Oftentimes in urban environments, especially where you have ongoing TMDLs on streams and urban flooding issues, it's simply a space issue in order to, number one, acquire the property to implement the green infrastructure solutions, or and number two, to ensure that they are operated and maintained properly. So that's one of the things that you have to keep in mind, especially with green infrastructure solutions, is they do have to be operated and maintained just like any other systematic solution for flooding. And that is something that needs to be planned for. But overall, and that's one of the things that we're working on with this study through our GIS analysis, is to identify areas that would be a potential good area to implement green solutions. So we want to be able to work with our communities and basically give them a shortened list of where nature preserves has already preserved some open space, or communities own the area already that they plan on implementing green infrastructure. So they can be very much complicated when there are several owners to the property where there's an issue, or if the community has some type of issue acquiring the system.
Yep, that M word, maintenance. I think that's with all mitigation projects.
Absolutely, 100%. And that's it's just like your house or your car. If you don't operate and maintain it appropriately, it will absolutely fail.
Another question that I thought we could take a look at was from Anna. She said, is the hazard mitigation plan integrated into the general plans, depending on how you do planning in Kentucky?
That's right.
Integration is key.
That's actually a great question. I'm glad Anna asked the question, because it's one of the things that we're working on. There's a compendium of plans for local communities, whether it's capital planning, hazard mitigation. Depending on how progressive a community is, they could have any of a number of plans. So one of the things that we're striving to do is to incorporate hazard mitigation planning into the capital planning process and the overall growth planning process for communities. And only then, when we're able to kind of bring all these components into an overall strategic initiative, will things really come together well. So it's a challenge that we're working on.
Yep, challenges. We've got a lot of challenges. Oh, there's another good one that just popped up about budgets.
Yes.
And I don't even know if we've had time to figure out budgets going forward with the COVID. Any idea how Kentucky is doing, and are the resilience efforts going to be impacted or halted due to lack of money?
Well, Kentucky, we're a fairly rural state, so that makes our budgets in comparison to some of the larger states in the union somewhat smaller, but we absolutely do have budget issues. In fact, our agency has already taken about $250,000 cut just before the end of the fiscal year in June of this year. So, that being said, we do anticipate that there will be challenges, but that's the reason that we've undertaken this effort, because with small pots of funding from various sources, you might not be able to accomplish large goals, but if you bring those resources together and pair EPA funds with FEMA funds, NRCS funds, state funds, and local funds, you may very well be surprised at what you're able to accomplish. And that's our goal, is to empower communities to make good decisions, but also to kind of play chess with the various pieces that are out there to point for folks to appropriate resources.
Yeah, you have a lot of players at the table, which are seem to be working quite well together. So,
absolutely, and historically, all the players haven't worked well, great, but that's one of the things that we're absolutely working on, and CAM has really been the catalyst into bringing all those players together.
Well, thank you so much, Carey. I do appreciate all your good work, and we have more questions. We could probably talk for a while longer, but it's time for me to introduce the next speaker. So, thank you, Carey.
Thank you very much.
Up next, we have mitigation planning effectiveness, how engagement in the mitigation planning process results in risk reduction measures. The presenters are Amanda Sharma from FEMA headquarters and Christine Caggiano from Resilience Action Partners. Hey everybody, so we're having some technical difficulties. Apparently the video that was recorded has some issues with it. So two things. First of all, we're going to go live and do some Q&A now. Christine and Amanda can share some of their talking points and we'll have a discussion. And then we will run a good video later today at a time that's available. So you all can check back in. We'll let you know what time that is. So Christine and Amanda, why don't you give us some updates on mitigation planning and resilience?
Great, thank you. Yeah, sorry about sounding like a chipmunk as we went in and out, but I guess what we're going to do is just be open up to some questions, but to give you an overview, and I understand it's going to be shown later, so for those of you who have the difficulty, you can come back in and see the presentation itself because there are some technical elements. But the national program is looking at basically evaluating program effectiveness and plan effectiveness. And so the presentation really gets to our strategy for doing that, showing our, looking at it as a logical association. You'll see in the presentational model, which looks at the activities that we generate, that basically the program and its stakeholders at some point, more into the short-term outcomes, participate in, which brings about that long-term risk reduction through that mitigation planning process. So I really like what Carey Johnson was pointing out. I felt like he could have done our presentation because a lot of what they're talking about with the integration, the implementation, the bringing that capital investment, that mitigation investment into the process, bringing those stakeholders together. That's really, in a nutshell, what we talk about when we talk about effective planning. In the presentation, you'll also learn a little more about how we, through a process of just assessing the mitigation planners across the nation within the regions, have defined some core components within what makes a plan effective. And I just like to always shout out, our planners have reviewed thousands of plans. And so when we ask them just anecdotally what makes a plan effective, it's really interesting just hearing from them. So a little bit of that was shared in the presentation as well. And trying to go into that slide, we broke it down into 6 categories. So really who you engage, the risk assessment and making sure that, you know, what you identify as a risk ties into that vulnerability and ultimately has a mitigation strategy or an action in particular set up for it. And then also just the idea of getting a project to that shelf readiness, so that when you're talking about that scope of work and even applying for a planning grant or whatever investment you're looking for, you have a really sound strategy of how to get that to happen. And then I know I heard, you know, we were talking, Cam was talking, or Carey was talking about in Cam, some of the disasters, and what is your strategy within the plan even to bring it to that place of being able to update as soon as you get that best available data or other information that comes out of that learning. So really some good stuff. Again, I apologize for the video. We're not sure what happened with the conversion from what we did to this platform, but I'll stop there because I know that I really want to give you time for questions. And Chrissy, I know you were talking about success stories. Anything you want to add before we turn it over?
Yeah, just, you know, one of the really important things when we're talking about the effectiveness of plans, this is really about thinking about all of the individual pieces that make a plan effective. And it's a little bit of a newer concept in the mitigation planning world. For a really long time, it's been you meet the requirements or you don't, and that's okay. So in building this portfolio or understanding of what effective planning is, the other piece of it is helping people understand what effective planning looks like in the field. So the work that I do leans a lot on behavioral science, and some of the lessons that we've learned are that bringing concreteness to an idea and actually showing and not telling what those examples look like is really important to have the uptake of what effective planning looks like. And so that's really where our success stories portfolio comes in. We're actively gathering these stories of really successful and effective mitigation plans with the intention of sharing them nationwide so that communities can go and look and see, okay, what other places that look or feel or sound sort of like me? If they can do it, then maybe I can do it and I can learn from their lessons. So we're in the infancy of that success stories portfolio, but we'd also love any of you who feel like you've got an effective and successful plan. Let us know so we can add you and celebrate your success.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions yet. Hopefully people still stuck around. Well, we've got 8 minutes, so let's hear some questions. Okay, Chad, always good for a good question. Should national requirements be strengthened when it comes to mitigation plan actions, follow up on actions, and evaluation of progress? Yeah, seems historic focus has been on risk assessments, so that's a good one.
Yeah, so I'll take that, and Chrissy, feel free to add in anything. So from the planning process itself and what's put forward, one of the things that the Plan Effectiveness Committee did assess is what is currently required and what is above, or what do we see that really brings about that effective plan that could be above that minimum requirement. So I don't have the answer for you today, but it is a great question. I will say that some of the things that were outlined and the process that we use for testing this and seeing how those things outlined, if they actually do bring about results. In other words, do we see more projects happening within a community that has some of these components that were identified as above, you know, that minimum requirement? Do we actually see greater results? That's some of the questions we're asking. That's some of the testing we're going to do. So we don't have the answer today, but it's definitely something that we are asking the same question on. So great question. You're right in line with what we're doing.
Yeah, and while I can't speak to whether or not there will be any CFR changes or policy changes, I'm not the part that I work on. I can say that we are in the process. We just recently finished updating our mitigation planning training for tribes and for states, and we're in the process of updating what's called our, it's our core G318 local planning workshop training. And we are very, very much trying to shift the emphasis in how we train and teach from you have to have the best available information in the risk assessment, but you have that information in the risk assessment as a means to identify problems and set mitigation strategies. So whether or not it ends up eventually in the requirements, we hear overwhelmingly when the planners go out and teach, their emphasis is, do the risk assessment, but you're doing it so that you can build that really strong mitigation strategy that is, at the end of the day, implementable. So I think we'll try and get there through other venues, even if our regulations stay the same.
Yeah, so now there's a lot of comments on data on what works and how do we share success stories. I know we have some historic return on investment studies we've done that FEMA does only when they come back to the exact same place there was a disaster before. So is there any other way of sharing success stories or return on investments? I know the new Mitigation Works return on investment numbers are out there, but
Yeah, so we've been developing the success stories both with longer format stories that are, I say longer, but it's about 2 pages, and then short abstracts that we plan to use, push out through our Gov Delivery channel. So if you're not signed up for the Mitigation Planning Gov Delivery channel, please do. That's how we'll be pushing some of that out. But then we're also going to be using the Esri Story Map platform to plot the stories on a map so you can see around the country where things are happening near you, where things are happening nationwide. And we're also taking the time to try and categorize the success stories. So it's not that you have to click through every single one when I'm really interested in what a successful integrated plan looks like, or I'm interested in what a plan that really does social vulnerability incorporation really well. So we're trying to do that categorization and then use the story map so that it's a slightly more visual format so that you could go in, click, see the plan, get the link to it, and get that short story.
Okay, I guess I cut out for a second there, sorry. Good. And Shuba's shared the link to send your success stories or to your results.
Thank you, Shuba.
Yep, good deal. Oh, there was a good one I saw. Ooh, brick discussion. Chad had addressed another one talking about from your perspective at headquarters, are you seeing more actions focused on land use, planning codes, and standards? I know that was in that 7-to-1 return on investment. It's a hard bucket of action sometimes, especially if the community land use planners are not involved. So any thoughts on those specific types of actions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that is, again, something we're going to start looking at is what those actions are. And from a national level, the regions are in much better position to say what they're seeing. Chrissy, I know maybe you could add some from maybe what Resilience Action Partners and some of the reviews that you guys have conducted, if you're seeing more of those. But yeah, that's not, unfortunately, I can get back with you on that question as far as what regions are seeing and if that's something we do see. But for now, I'll prefer to.
Sure. We are definitely seeing that as an uptick in the conversation in the mitigation plans. It is much more common in states that have strong planning enabling legislation. If you're interested, if your state has that enabling legislation, APA has done a really good study on that as a cooperating technical partner. And I think the other thing that was really telling is before the mitigation action measure associated with the risk map program was decommissioned, we really saw a shift in around about 2016 where it went from the majority of actions in the tracker attributable to risk map as being structural to flipping almost entirely that most of them were higher floodplain management standards, overlay zones, and other land use, other types of land use tools. So that is probably the most comprehensive piece of data that I have to show that, yes, we have seen that flip in the risk map space. And I think we're getting there in the planning space, but it depends, it really depends community to community and who the community chooses to involve in the planning process.
Thank you. Rod has a really good one. How do we get plans to look at the entire building inventory at risk of flooding and identify mitigation options as opposed to the current model of focusing on repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss properties? Before I turn it over, I know in Minnesota we do a hazardous level 2, and so that spits out what specifically is in the floodplain and what's not. But is it, how else can we promote those facilities that are in harm's way for mitigation? Any thoughts?
So I'll add my 2 cents, and then Chrissy, I know you have lots of thoughts. I can see it on her face. It's definitely in the getting the right people to the table. So that's one of the things we talk about when the planners were talking about with the plan effectiveness. And I go back to Carey's presentation with Cam. getting the people who know what the issue are, who have the information that you need to consider, bring them up front and in early. Kissy?
Yeah, and a really essential part of that is the people that are going to have building information are going to be folks who sit in the planning, zoning, inspecting space. I would say if all else fails, within the past, I want to say 2 years, Microsoft released a nationwide building footprint layer. Use the data that you have, even if it's not perfect, if it helps you to kind of show what that risk is. Don't be afraid to lean on what is in HAZUS to try and think about, are there pieces that you can extract from that, that even if you're not doing a full HAZUS analysis, there's a lot of data that is included in that software program that you could use for your risk assessment. But I think the most important thing is bring your building folks to the table. Chances are they've got a parcel assessment database because they have to manage their taxes. Bring the people who do the inspections in. They will know where the data is and where the new development is. And I would say that emphasis on bringing in what has changed is something that we tend to see as a weakness in the plans, but now that a lot of the nation is on their plan updates, that's so important because the risk isn't going to be static, and every time you put a new building in, you're probably going to be shifting the risk of it.
Yeah, and just adding to that, I mean, we're at a floodplain management conference, and so we have the floodplain managers here, the stormwater managers here, and you're going to see things that may not always be in the data itself. Just thinking of my days as a planner when I had a irrigation ditch that busted out and it flooded 12 properties. And that's not on our map. That's not something, we knew it as a floodplain manager, you know it because you're out there doing it. So, get yourself to the table too, because you're very valuable in bringing that, that look and that need to those buildings that could be affected that may not be obvious.
All right. Well, thank you, ladies, for being so resilient in the face of technological hazards. So lastly, we have planning for hazards, implementing flood-specific tools and strategies to reduce risk and build resilience. Our presenter is Ryan Carroll from Michael Baker.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Coming to you tonight from the playroom. So in this session of today's mitigation track, I'm going to talk about how an emphasis on planning can help communities mitigate hazards through land use oriented solutions. So what we're going to do is take a look specifically at something the state of Colorado has done with its Planning for Hazards Guide, and talk about how this resource is helping communities both in Colorado and outside of the state with implementation of land use strategies to reduce risk and build resilience. So let's backtrack a little bit here. When I first started attending the ASFPM annual conference, planning wasn't necessarily a hot topic. You may have found one concurrent session on it or two, but certainly not an entire track, right? Over the years, it's certainly become a lot more prominent. And as floodplain managers, we sometimes forget how interrelated these topics are: planning, floodplain management, emergency management, and so on. Really, they share many of the same goals, right? So keeping people safe, protecting life and property, we always hear that thrown around. Protecting investments, protecting neighborhoods, social connectivity, economic viability, right? And what we've found in practice is that land use planning can actually be one of the most cost-effective forms of hazard mitigation there is. But there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. You've got to consider your audience, right? In this case, your audience is the community staff, stakeholders, the political players within the community, the businesses within the community, the economic drivers, and so on. Let's remember that for later in the presentation, right? So what land use strategies exist and that people are using that can mitigate hazards? The ones you see here are specific tools that have been proven effective all over the country. And you'll notice that a lot of this falls into the non-structural mitigation category, right? So we're not talking about engineered and constructed works. sometimes that's the issue, right? You get local decision makers to agree to build a bigger, safer, stronger bridge. There's usually great support for that. But when decision makers have to say no to a developer, sometimes the support for that decision is lacking. So getting to know is difficult to do unless you have some of these strategies in place already. So how can communities take some of those strategies and implement them, right? How can they execute on those strategies? I'll start by saying that many communities out there, they have the data to guide risk reduction activities. If a community has a mitigation plan, a hazard mitigation plan, there's a lot of data that goes into creating those plans. If a community has a flood insurance rate map, especially a recent one, there's a lot of great data that gets produced with those efforts, right? So they have the data. They have a lot of tried and true local processes that exist. Planning commission, council, commissioners, the public review process that goes along with those things. And they a lot of times have a good understanding of their risk, where the risk is, what neighborhoods see the greatest depth of flooding, where buildings and infrastructure are at risk of wildfire, where there might be isolated communities after an earthquake because the roads cut off, that sort of thing. They have a good understanding of their risk. But what is challenging to them a lot of the times is being able to implement some of those strategies to reduce their risk. That's where they need the most support. So they have the data, they have the processes, and they have an understanding, but it's getting to the milestones and taking the step-by-step approach you need in order to get to the finish line that they sometimes struggle with. And that might be contractor support that they need, that might be financial support. There's a lot of factors that can influence the success of some of these strategies and success of implementation, right? Size of community, population, the actual size, geographic extent, where is it located? What sort of capabilities exist at the community level? Time and resources, financial capability, we already mentioned that. And then another one to mention, the legal authority. There are some communities out there, and we're working with some now, that don't necessarily have the legal authority to enact more strict regulations than what are pushed down from the state level. And those can be challenging factors to overcome during implementation for sure. So why are we talking about this? Why is planning an important part of hazard mitigation? If you've ever written or reviewed a hazard mitigation plan, you probably know that looking to the future is important when you're profiling your hazards and you're looking at your vulnerabilities and you're setting up your mitigation strategy, right? You can do that by looking at the hazard activity from the past. And if you take a look at this graph, you'll see over the last 40 years, the number of billion-dollar disasters have been on a steady increase. And communities should be mindful of what that might mean for their future. Land use planning certainly provides a mechanism for protecting communities from future disaster losses. I want to switch gears a little bit to Colorado's story, because that is kind of the bulk of, not necessarily the bulk of what I want to talk about today, but it's a big reason why I'm presenting on this topic, the work that Colorado put into this. Over the last 10 years, and I should say that the wildfire data that I'm presenting here doesn't necessarily include this wildfire season. I think this is current as of last year. But since 2010, there have been 33 wildfires that exceeded 10,000 acres in the state. There have been 3 that exceeded 100,000 acres. So those are pretty big events, and we've had some destructive ones as well, as far as losses are concerned. And then in 2013, the state experienced one of its worst floods on record. In a 5-day period, the rainfall exceeded the average annual rainfall. in most areas, in the affected areas, that is. There were 19,000 homes damaged, 1,700 that were completely destroyed. And as communities started the recovery process, repairing, rebuilding, and reopening, what was found is that a lot of them lacked good direction. They lacked strong land use regulations to ensure that things were being done with an eye towards mitigating future losses. So something that the state was working on, and at the time decided to pilot with some of those communities that were most significantly impacted by that 2013 flood event, was something called the Planning for Hazards Guide. The official name is Planning for Hazards, Land Use Solutions for Colorado. There have been a couple drafts, but it came out shortly after the floods, actually. And it was a project that was initiated by the Colorado Department of Local Affairs, Division of Local Government, basically to demonstrate how communities could use some of these land use strategies to reduce their risk of damage from future events, from flood, wildfire, and many other hazards, actually, as well. There's a guide, there's a print guide, which you see on the left, and there's also a really informative website, which you see the link to there on the bottom right. Kind of emulates some of the information in the guide, and that's sort of the piece that's being updated over time as well, with lots of new tools and information. So yeah, this was a great and very timely piece that was put out by the state, and working with those communities that were significantly impacted from the floods kind of gave a glimpse into, you know, the real purpose of this document. You've got this group of communities that you know, went through significant amount of flood losses, significant amount of damage, and not just flooding. There were debris flows, landslides as well, and all those hazards are covered in here. But then being able to take some of these strategies and apply them to those communities, so that if this were to happen again, they're a little bit better prepared, because they're rebuilding in a way that's going to help mitigate some of those losses in the future. So the guide itself, I mentioned it deals with more than just flooding and wildfire. It's kind of a multi-hazard guide. And what you're seeing here is a representation of some of the most common hazards in the state of Colorado. So that's something to be mindful of as you get into this. If you're not from Colorado and this is a resource that you want to tap into, there's certainly strategies in here that would apply, but some hazards may or may not be covered. So it breaks things down by hazard, and then it breaks things down by the type of tool that you can use to work to mitigate those hazards as well. And you see those across the bottom there. So, and then taking that a step further, each of those kind of high-level tools, like addressing hazards in plans and policies, strengthening incentives, protecting sensitive areas, are broken down even further with the information you see here. So this kind of gets into the specifics. What specifically can a community do from a land use planning perspective to mitigate against wildfire, to mitigate against flooding? So some examples, you know, beefing up your application submittal process requirements for proposed development, or for development applications, or for permit applications, whatever your community might use in that review structure. Adopting higher floodplain management standards in your codes and ordinances. Stream buffers and setbacks is another good one. And then for some of the, I don't want to say urbanized areas, but certainly some of these would apply in some locations and some maybe in others, but cluster development to avoid hazards. There are communities that practice that kind of commonplace from a land use perspective. And also being able to incentivize hazard mitigation, like providing transferable development credits or transfer of development rights. So those are just a few of the examples of the tools and strategies that are kind of summarized in this guide in detail, actually. And here's what that looks like. So this specific example is for stream buffers and setbacks. And a few pages in the guide dedicated to that. And each of the sections, each hazard essentially, or each tool I should say, is broken down into these same sections. So there's an overview of how the tool works, how a community can implement it, examples of where it's been done, and then some of the advantages and disadvantages or challenges of implementing that particular strategy or tool. And then also some other resources that would help communities with implementation. So if you're going to be adopting higher floodplain management standards, there might be some of that template language or model ordinance language, model code language included in here for reference or for you to borrow from, which is great. So that was the printed version of the guide, available in PDF form also. And then here is this is just kind of a sample of what you might see on the website. It contains a lot of the same information. Again, we're looking at stream buffers and setbacks here. But what I want to point out with the online version is that under that additional resources tab that popped up there on the right, you can actually follow links to example communities across the state that are using this specific tool. So stream buffers and setbacks being used in these communities there under that additional resources tab. And it will link you to a page on the city's website or the county's website or what have you that talks specifically about that tool, or maybe even link directly to the code language that covers that specific land use tool. So one of the visions that the state also had for this was a series of workshops, and they partnered with FEMA on this first workshop series that came out of the Planning for Hazards guide to put on 2 workshops. One was more focused on the wildfire hazard, one a little bit more focused on flood hazards, as those are some of the more prominent hazards in the state of Colorado here. So yes, there were 2 separate workshops, and the idea was, let's work with these communities to identify a particular tool that they want to try to implement and work through kind of this step-by-step process to help them get to full implementation of that tool. You can see the first workshop had about 4 communities, and again, that was more focused on wildfire. The second workshop was a little bit more heavily attended. There were 7 communities at that one, and these communities were actually selected kind of as like a best fit. They had to obviously be willing participants. They had to be able to get the right people to the table. So that includes not just floodplain managers or the wildfire folks, but planners, community officials, and that community official piece. You think about a commissioner on the board or a council member. Those are the folks that communities really have to try to sell this to. So to be able to get them on board with this really helps. When it comes time to present this to the Board of Commissioners and have some support already on the board, which is great. So here's kind of a look at how the process went for the workshop piece of this project. And there's a lot more that's happening behind the scenes than just the workshop itself, right? And you can kind of see the timeline at the bottom there corresponds to some of the steps that you're seeing at the top. And we referred to them as roadmap chapters. So the first thing we're going to do when we get together with these communities, and it might be a meeting, it might be a phone call, it might be a webinar, but we're going to chat with them about their existing capabilities, their existing ordinances and codes and land use regulations to get an understanding of what they're already doing. And then they're going to kind of tell us some of the things that they are and aren't doing and what they wish they would be doing. And that's going to help us kind of narrow down on a particular tool or strategy to work with them on. So that's happening kind of in the first 2 meetings. You'll see there that roadmap chapter 2, the tool and strategy confirmation. That's where we actually kind of work with them to select the tool that we're going to help them implement. And so there's a lot of data collection that goes into it, a lot of research. And then we start getting into the details, right? We're starting to prepare for the workshop itself. And once we get to the workshop, again, what we're trying to do is walk out of there with specific actionable steps that the community is going to take back and start working on. It could be that we're providing them with model code language. Let's use that adoption of higher development standards as an example here. So at that workshop, we're sitting down with our particular community and we're saying, this is the tool that you wanted to work with. We've identified some of the higher standards you want to have in place. Here's some code language for you to take back and review and see if it kind of fits with those standards that you wanted to regulate and you wanted to implement. And you can see the kind of preparation for that workshop and execution of the workshop itself is that first 6-month time frame. Then over on the right side, you can see the very condensed piece of the schedule, but it's the longest piece, is from month 6 to month 18. That's a full year there. You're giving community time to go back and go through the process of implementing that tool locally. So that might mean presenting to the Planning Commission the higher standards you wish to adopt. Kind of releasing for public review and comment some of that code language that's associated with the higher standard you want to adopt. So that's all happening kind of in that year time frame. And then the idea is we'll check back in with you in a year's time and see how you did. Did you get to implementation? So here's that we hit that year time frame in September of 2019. So September of last year. So we started to check back in with some of the communities, and what we were finding was that did they make progress? Yes, and I'll summarize a little bit more about all of the communities here in a moment. But two specifically that we'll look at is the city of Longmont and the city of Denver. Yes, they made progress, but they did run into some issues. They time and resources again came up as somewhat problematic. They did. What else was the challenge? Sometimes lack of support from other departments, and they pointed specifically to just education, right? Sometimes floodplain managers have a hard job because they kind of have to sell some of the work that they're doing, even internally, to their coworkers to get on board with. I know lots of floodplain managers who've kind of encountered that issue where they're kind of having to explain themselves a lot. And so this particular community ran into that same issue. And there was a general lack of public support as well. And by the way, Longmont did choose adoption of higher standards. But there were some benefits to it as well. They were able to involve city council, and they saw that as a huge benefit. They were able to gain a lot of insight into other beneficial actions like improving their CRS rating. They were actually able to go up from I think a class 7 to a class 5 or something like that during flood recovery, which was great. And they actually also began to realize some of not just their floodplain ordinance, but a lot of other documents in the community that needed to be updated to ensure consistency across all those documents. Right. So with the city of Denver, they chose property acquisition as like a property acquisition program as their tool of choice, and they also made some progress. But again, they ran into similar challenges of staff time and resources kind of being pulled in different directions. And one of the things they pointed out also that was problematic and that we're trying to solve for moving forward here is that they started to get further and further away in time from the workshop. And that distance from the workshop it led to kind of things falling off, right? They weren't as motivated possibly, or it just wasn't at the top of their list. It wasn't fresh on their minds. So I think the lesson learned there is checking in with these communities a little bit more frequently and actually supporting them along the way during that year, or at least until they're actually implementing their chosen tool. So here's kind of an overall summary of our findings, right? That the two communities we just talked about, Longmont and Denver, they're kind of included in that semi-successful grouping here. So they made progress, right? But they didn't get to full implementation. In fact, we only had 2 communities of those, what was it, 12 or 14 or so, 2 communities total that got to full successful implementation of their chosen tool. But others made some progress, 3, and 3 more were minimally successful. So that's minimal or no progress, actually. And I think it would be good to focus in on those and try to figure out why some of those communities weren't successful. What were the real reasons, right? And then there were some communities that we just didn't hear from again. So again, that might go back to, maybe there was staff turnover. Some of the people that were involved before aren't necessarily involved anymore, that sort of thing. And maybe we just didn't choose the right communities, or maybe their interest waned or something like that. But at any rate, you can see it's kind of a normal distribution there. We didn't necessarily want that. We would hope to see more successful communities out of this. So that's why there need to be some changes to this process moving forward. So some of the ideas for kind of restructuring things, focusing the workshop on so this is feedback specifically from some of the participants, focusing in on a specific tool and getting multiple communities on board with that tool possibly. I think that would involve a lot more upfront screening of communities to determine who actually would benefit from that specific tool the most. Continued education and the 6-month follow-up meeting, those are kind of along the same lines, right? Like they want us to check in more frequently, and I think that makes sense. And then funding assistance. We heard that a couple times where there are certainly a lot of planning grants out there, and some communities would love to have them. They just don't have the time, resources, expertise, or success rate with going after grants, and they need a lot of support with that. So we're continuing to try to push this stuff to get communities or to take the workshops on the road. What's great about what they've added to the guide itself online is that it's kind of a choose your adventure, right? Or communities can do this on their own if they want. They don't necessarily need to wait for FEMA and/or the state to come in and run a series of workshops for them. There's a lot of great resources online for communities to be able to do that. And again, a community could do it on its own if they've got the time and resources. Certainly there are contractors available to do this sort of work as well. But the other thing that's happening is that FEMA is trying to take this out to other states and other regions outside of Colorado and FEMA Region 8. And so far, we've been successful in doing that in the state of New Jersey. We've kicked off a project in the spring here, just in April actually. Partnership again between FEMA and the state of New Jersey. We're going to be doing virtual workshops now, just like our virtual ASFPM conference, right? And it's gonna be for 8 coastal communities in New Jersey. So that puts a little different spin on things. We're talking about different hazards, different potential land use solutions for those hazards. And there's certainly some other unique challenges, right? Like state level regulatory control. That's something that exists in New Jersey, and it's hard for them to push down, it's hard for them to adopt more stringent regulations than the state has. But so we've got our work cut out for us there, but we are in the midst of preparing for the workshop there, which is great. So keys to making things successful, and I'm going to try to be brief here since we're basically at our time limit here, but you got to consider the community context, right? It matters what the community is doing, who the players are in the community, what strengths and weaknesses it has, right? And again, time and resources. If you can seek that out ahead of time, it's gonna be really beneficial. Working with local elected officials, I mentioned that as a big benefit, and educating across department lines. That's absolutely necessary. And like I mentioned, there are resources to learn from with the Colorado and New Jersey workshops, the guide and the website that exists from Colorado, and other communities in the state, right? And again, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. You're gonna have to tailor your product to the communities and states that you're working with out there, right? So that's really important. We're doing it for New Jersey, and we're gonna have to do it again when we go somewhere new, right? So, but really a cool way to get communities the help they need to implement some of these land use strategies for hazard mitigation. That's really what we're after, right? So thank you very much, everyone, and I will take your questions.
Thanks, Ryan. That was a great presentation. A lot of stuff going on in Denver or in Colorado. So thank you so much for that great presentation, sharing your tool with us. We only have about a minute for questions. But one interesting one I did see is if you have any opinions on using moratoria for interim prevention of unsustainable development while developing new codes to prevent developers to get a foot in the door before planning and zoning regulations change. So that's a good question. Oh, you're on mute. Still mute.
How's that?
Good, I can hear you now.
All right, great. Sorry about that. It's a great question. And in fact, there were some communities immediately following that 2013 flood event that did enact some building moratoriums and development moratoriums. And that was intended to kind of give them some time to think about, you know, the emergency phase really while the flooding was still going on, to think about the response phase and then the recovery phase and what reconstruction and rebuilding might look like during that time. Now, specific to like a general code update, I don't think it's a bad idea, at that point either. I would think it would more likely apply if you are going to be updating some of your minimum requirements in your ordinance or adopting higher standards, that sort of thing. So that I think in that sense, or in that respect, it does make sense. But I think some advice that I can give would be to be open and upfront about some of those requirements that you're considering, so that some of these developers aren't necessarily blindsided when that code update finally does go through. Right? We did help some of those communities post flood update some of their codes and ordinances, and we were really proactive upfront about getting some of the concepts out there that we were considering, and having that public feedback loop, which was important to kind of getting things correct and having people understand what was coming down the line. And then the time period, I think, is important to consider too. You don't want to enact a building moratorium if you think your code update typically would take 1 to 2 years almost. I mean, that's really putting an undue burden on some of those developers possibly. So consider the time frame that you'd be operating under as well.
Wonderful. Well, we're over time actually, so I'm gonna have to cut you short. And there's some more questions. I don't know if you want to reach out directly. But thank you everyone so much for resilience and hazard mitigation presentations. Carey, Amanda, Christine, and Ryan, do appreciate you presenting. And I think we're, United States, we're in good hands. We gotta keep mitigating for the future coming hazards. So we will reach out somehow and let you know when that middle presentation from FEMA headquarters about planning and mitigation will be available. I don't have that information yet, but it'll definitely be available later after this. So thank you very much for joining the session. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, bye.